Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Rabbi Mike Urim, and I am newly rejoined with the Pardes family. I am just started in January as the Chief Vision and Education Officer of a new educational initiative called Pardes North America. So for about 48 years, Pardes has been saying that it is all about Torah for everyone. And we are doubling down on making that promise real and bringing all sorts of new learning and Torah learning opportunities to North America through this new initiative. And Machloket Matters is emerging as one of the pieces of Pardes North America, really targeted towards North American audiences. And so very happy to greet and to welcome everyone today. This is the second part in a two-part series about bringing the ideas of Machloket Matters to the academic world. The first was led by Daniel Roth, who I believe is on the call and just had a new book that was released on this subject called Third Party Peacemakers. And Daniel has a 20-year history with Pardes and helped found Machloket Matters, the curriculum, and the Pardes Center for Conflict Resolution. And so I want to acknowledge him and to say Mazal Tov on the new book. And of course, we're very excited to have Howard here as well. But my final job today in greeting is to introduce Erica Brown, who does not need much of an introduction. I want to just say, you know Erica as an incredible educator and author, and she is the director of the Mayberg Center for Jewish Education and Leadership and an associate professor at George Washington University. And it's just such a pleasure to have both of you here today. And I turn it over to you, Erica.
Thank you so much. I was kind of hoping, given your background, that you were going to play guitar for us a little bit, Mike, and sort of get us in the mood to think about conflict resolution. It's a delight. I want to welcome all of you. It's a delight to work in partnership with Pardes. I've had an ongoing relationship with Pardes for so many years and admire. I regularly get. I wish I could attend everything that you do because I get emails all the time about the wonderful educational work that you're putting on. Machloket Matters, this lecture series is a joint effort, a partnership between the Mayberg Center for Jewish Education and Leadership at the Graduate School of Education and Human Development at the George Washington University and our Judaic Studies Department. And Professor Rob Eisen led Daniel Roth in conversation. I have the distinct honor of leading this book talk with Howard Kaminsky. Dr. Kaminsky is a research fellow at the Pardes Center for Judaism and Conflict Resolution. He serves as a mediator for Community Mediation Services in Queens, New York. He has an EDD in religion and education from Teachers College, Columbia University, and rabbinic ordination. So I should introduce you also as Rabbi Howard Kaminsky.
Howard is fine. Howard is fine.
Howard is fine. Mesivta Tifereth Jerusalem. It's lovely to see you, Howard. Thank you for being with us. Most important for our purposes is this fantastic book, which I understand from Howard is too expensive in hardcover, but go buy yourself a copy in softcover. As you can see, it is a wellspring of wonderful sources, Jewish sources in their analysis on conflict resolution, called Fundamentals of Jewish Conflict Resolution, Traditional Jewish Perspectives on Resolving Interpersonal Conflicts. So if you can help us resolve interpersonal conflicts, especially, I think, given the news out of Israel in the past few days, I think the conversation couldn't be more relevant. So welcome.
Pleasure and honor to be here. I can't thank you enough for inviting me.
So tell us something, Howard, about this book and what inspired you to write it.
Okay, as far as the book goes, the way I like to describe it, my basic abridged elevator speech would be, the book discusses how you're supposed to handle conflict in your life based upon traditional Jewish sources, without the intervention of any type of third-party intermediary. That's the shortened version. That's the very simple version.
So it's sort of like the exact opposite of what Daniel Roth spoke about last week, which was the role of mediators in conflict resolution. We're going to teach us how to do this without hiring anybody.
Exactly, you got it. Save you some money over here. I don't discuss mediation or arbitration. That I say for some other people. But a little more detailed, a slightly more detailed explanation of what the book would be. The basic description I give on the back cover is that the book offers an in-depth presentation of traditional Jewish approaches to interpersonal conflict resolution. Just to be clear, so everyone understands what I'm talking about, interpersonal conflict is the sort of conflict that takes place between two individuals. For example, a husband and wife, siblings, two friends, co-workers, etc. So what I do in the book is that I examine what I would describe as the underlying principles, the rules and guidelines for dealing with interpersonal conflicts, once again, without the assistance of any type of third party. And I cover a whole bunch of topics in the book. I start off focusing on underlying fundamental values of Jewish conflict resolution. I talk about the basic obligations of pursuing peace and refraining from destructive conflict. I've got a chapter on what constitutes a rabbinic perspectives on constructive conflict. I've got another chapter that focuses on the mitzvah of dan l'chaf zechut, judging people favorably and countering judgmental biases. We all know that when you're involved in a conflict, all sorts of prejudices and biases kick in. And this chapter, it presents, based upon traditional Jewish sources, how you're supposed to deal with those types of things. A major topic in the book is, just it's logical, how you're supposed to deal with conflict through dialogue. I've got a huge, huge chapter on apologies and forgiveness. And I have, it's the last chapter in the book, I have what I consider a nice chapter on anger management. And for all of these topics, what I'm doing is I present the traditional Jewish approaches and I compare and contrast them with contemporary approaches. That's the basic summary of what the book's about. As far as what led me to write this book, that is not such an easy answer, a question to answer, definitely not. There were many, many factors that came into play. Going back, way back when in my yeshiva days, I always had an interest in bein adam lachavero, interpersonal relations. I was always reading Sifrei Musar, books on Jewish character development, the Jewish ethics. I think it was about 25 years ago, I was in chinuch, I was in Jewish education. And I remember thinking to myself one day something along the lines of, man, oh man, could these kids use some serious help with their bein adam lechavero? And to be totally honest, it wasn't only the kids who needed the help. The teachers, and when I talk about the teachers, I'm including myself, the administration, the parents, we all needed help. It seemed like wherever I was turning, and it wasn't only as a teacher, it was wherever I was turning. I saw my relatives, my friends, and in my own personal relationships, people were struggling and they were suffering due to an inability to appropriately handle interpersonal conflicts, and I would say a general lack of emotional intelligence. So what happened was eventually I ended up going to graduate school. I was going to Teachers College at Columbia. And when it came time to write my doctoral dissertation, I wanted to write on something very meaningful, something that people would benefit from. So I decided that my topic would be Jewish approaches to conflict, interpersonal conflict resolution. So that was some of the things that led me to write the book, but there were other personal things that came into play. Back in 2011, my father had passed on. A few months after that, I found out that I was going to be laid off from work. Then right around the same time, that was when Daniel Roth called me for the first time. He introduced himself and he started to tell me that he thought that my dissertation was so great. So those were some of the other things that came into play. You know, I wasn't married, I didn't have kids to support, and I wanted to do something significant in life. So those are some of the things that led me to write the book.
Wow. I thought you wrote the whole book for me so that I can solve my problem.
That was something else. I'm just giving you a small amount of things that came into play. I was thinking, you know, Erica Brown would really appreciate this.
Needs this book. Well, you know, look, the topics that you address in the table of contents read as a manual for how to improve your relationships generally. It's not only conflict, it's sort of the everyday engagement and the hustle and tussle of what it means to live in community with others. So, you know, you addressed many things in your answer, but I'm wondering what problem you were specifically trying to solve with its publication.
As far as a specific problem goes, you know, there was a noticeable void when it came to books in English that related to Judaism and conflict resolution. In Hebrew, there was a diverse and a very impressive body of literature that did offer what I would describe as in-depth analyses of specific aspects of traditional Jewish conflict resolution. And then there were also more extensive works that covered multiple topics. But it was pretty clear that in English, there was no in-depth systematic study of the major components of traditional Judaism's perspective on conflict resolution. And it was Mark Gopin, who was a major player in this field. He had already highlighted that in his book, Between Eden and Armageddon, back in 2000. And I felt that my book would be able to take a small first step in trying to fill that void. So that was really the focal problem, which led me to work on this.
And you know, you're not only a theoretician, you're actually involved in mediation in Queens, New York.
Well, I'll be honest with you. Right now, life happens. You know what I mean?
It certainly happened in 2020 and 2021.
Yeah, that's for sure. That's for sure. So I haven't actually, over the past 2 years, I really haven't been doing too much mediation. But prior to that, I was.
Prior to that, I'm intrigued at how the sort of the theories that you were working with had practical application in the work that you were doing with people.
As far as practical applications go, so I was working in a mediation center, and this center had a specific model that they wanted everybody to use. And it was very much the standard model of mediation, however, there are different ways to describe this type of model. It's a problem-solving model. This specific model was developed by someone by the name of Mark Kleiman, from Queens. It was a values-based model. It's a beautiful model. So as far as incorporating my material, my approach, which I describe in the book, I was quite limited as far as actually applying it to the mediations that I was doing. As far as applying it to real life situations, you know, I honestly believe my material has innumerable applications of real life applications. I've applied it to conflicts that I've encountered in life. You know, mostly we're talking about, as I said, the focus is interpersonal conflicts. So that's where I've used it, and that's where those are the simplest applications. You know, just to give you, it's kind of a simple type of application. But I remember I had a coworker who she had an explosive temper, and she would fly off the handle at every little thing that would happen, which she didn't like. And I remember, you know, I was teaching at the time, and she would start screaming at me for what what I personally considered the most insane things. You know, if I'd put something down in my classroom in the wrong place, or if I was too nice to my students, you can't make this up. She would start screaming at me, and yeah, it became so bad at one point. It became just a painful experience to go into work. So I remember thinking to myself, you know, I don't know if anybody else is applying the material that I've used, but let me try to apply some of it. And I did. You know, I followed some of the guidelines that I discussed in the book, and things turned out relatively well for a little while. Then things went back to the old way. I tried again, and then tried to employ some other things I discussed. And in the end result, things turned out relatively well between us. We actually became relatively good friends at the end of all this story. But so there are endless amount of applications.
Yeah. Did you send her a copy of the book? I'm just curious.
Oh, no. I didn't want. But she just sent me regards only about 2-3 days ago, just out of the blue. So, okay, so that there are applications, many applications.
You mentioned that you were working in a center where there was a construct to handle mediation, but it wasn't your construct. Can you share with us what the construct is in your book? The overall construct that you have been working with and that you created?
Let me make one thing clear. As far as what I created, I created very little. What I really tried to do in this book was I tried to keep my voice as quiet as possible and just do research and explore what traditional Jewish approaches were. I primarily focused on halachic literature, and I tried to
for our audience.
Define yes, of course. Halachic literature, that's Jewish law, halacha. So there's an enormous amount of material in traditional Jewish literature that deals with interpersonal relations. So being that I had certain constraints as far as how much I could write about, I tried to focus in on what I personally felt. And it wasn't only me, it was based upon what I saw in the traditional sources, that they emphasize when it comes to interpersonal relations, how you're supposed to prevent conflict, and if you can't prevent it, how you're supposed to resolve it. So basically, as I said before, I present certain fundamental underlying values, and then I discuss the basic interpersonal obligations that Judaism focuses on, such things as, if you have an interpersonal issue between you and somebody else, you're supposed to resolve it with respectful and sensitive dialogue. That's what I describe as the centerpiece of my book. There's all sorts of other types of interpersonal obligations which are discussed, which they lay the groundwork about how, as you pointed out, it's not only in conflicts, it's how you're supposed to interact with another human being. You have to be respectful, you have to speak to people with sensitivity, et cetera, et cetera. If you mess up, if you hurt somebody, you're supposed to be introspective and have the emotional wherewithal, the emotional maturity to be able to go over and apologize and say you're sorry. On the receiving end, if somebody hurts you, you should be able to be open to them and to be able to forgive them when it's called for. So that's just some of what I'm focusing on, some of what I present. It's to summarize it in a nutshell, it's not too simple, but there's a lot in there. What can I say?
So could you, just to give all of our audience today a flavor of the book,
Sure.
Can I invite you to select something to read from the book and why that appealed to you? And I also want to invite anyone who is listening today to drop your questions into the chat room, and we'll share them with Howard.
As far as things to focus on in the book, I don't know if I'm going to read it because it would take too much time, but just to briefly summarize, there's one selection, one area in the book, which I've mentioned already as we've been talking, the concept of interacting with, well, dealing with conflict through dialogue. There's a verse in Leviticus. The verse is, Lo tisna et achicha bilvavecha. You shouldn't hate your brother in your heart. Hocheach tochiach et amitecha. Rather, you're supposed to reprove the person. What exactly does that mean? So all the classic commentators, but many of the classic commentators, they explain that verse is dealing with a situation when somebody's done something to offend you, something to hurt you, something that upsets you, and you're feeling resentment, you start to feel hatred towards that person. What you're supposed to do is you go over to the other person, you engage in some form of dialogue, you present your grievances, you present it in an open, but yet in a very sensitive and respectful manner, and thereby you want to try to resolve your issues. So once again, it's enormous, but one of the most terrific selections I've got in this book, one thing I love to focus on in the book is Maimonides' explanation of that mitzvah. So in Maimonides' Mishnah Torah, in his 6th chapter of his Hilchot Deot, his book of knowledge, he's got a section over there about dispositions, interpersonal relations. And the way he spells out the guidelines for that mitzvah, it's out of this world. It's just in 4 little subsections. He incorporates so much material in these subsections. The first subsection, he presents the basic idea. Somebody does something, you're upset, you resent the person, go over, broach the topic and discuss it with them. The next subsection, he talks about the guidelines of the dialogue you're supposed to have. And he says that you're supposed to do this in private, preferably in private if you can. You don't want to embarrass the person, you want just between the two of you. And you speak to the person benachat, gently, ubelashon raka, in a soft manner, with sensitivity. The next subsection, he goes on, he continues with the guidelines. He says you do your best to avoid embarrassing the person when you discuss the topic. And his 4th subsection, he deals with a very practical question. What happens, the person that you're dealing with is the sort of individual who you just cannot have a conversation with. The way he describes it is, for example, he says the person is dato mishubeshet. There's something wrong with the way their mind works or the way they perceive things. Or the person is hedyot biyoter, somebody who's very common or crass, and you just can't deal with that type of person. So what he does is he says, if you can't deal with the other person, you only have one other option. You got to try to deal with yourself, and you got to focus on how your own emotions and how you're behaving, how you're reacting. And best case scenario, you try to find it in your heart to forgive the person. And if you can't forgive the person so that he doesn't address over there, that's a whole other topic of discussion later on in the book. But there are so many elements, so many fundamental elements of conflict resolution in those 4 little subsections. It's, you're not supposed to, you just walk around with hatred. You try not to ignore conflict. The importance of positive, constructive communication, forgiveness. How do you deal with people if you can't deal with them? It encapsulates so much in such incredibly succinct terms. It's terrific. And just, just to be clear, I'm over. That's an extreme oversimplification that I just gave you. There's tons and tons of more stuff that's in that little section. So that's something I most definitely focus on, and for me, that's a very meaningful selection. And by the way, Erica, may I interrupt just for 1 second, because forget about me talking. I know that you've lectured on the topic of conflict resolution. I remember that you wrote on the topic of Judaism and conflict resolution. I'd like to ask you the same question. What's your favorite topic? Your favorite Jewish text that relates to Judaism and conflict resolution?
Well, can I pick 2?
Yeah, sure. Go for it.
That's such like a DC lawyer question. Can I add to that? I think there are two things that I think about a lot, and I actually do have a question for you, Howard, on that source of Maimonides and how you handle it. But I would say one comes from Mishle, from the book of Proverbs, that you correct a wise person and he'll love you, and you correct a fool and he'll hate you. And I think it's up to you to determine who's wise enough to be open to improvement and who will respond negatively. I do a lot of editing, as I just finished correcting a senior thesis. And you do see it with students. There's certain students who so much value the editing process, and when they look at that proverbial red pen, they understand that you're invested and you take them seriously, and as a result of that serious critique, they will get better. And I certainly feel this when my work is edited. To me, it's in Hebrew, a correction is a tikkun, and to me, that's real tikkun. Like tikkun olam is the editing process itself, which every writer I know is a good writer loves the editor, because the editor, and the harder the editor, the more you love the editor. But I see other reactions, which is that people aren't really that interested in self-improvement. They see the red pen and they get angry at you. So that to me is a text that's always spoken to me. And the other one is maybe a more well-known on conflict from Ethics of the Fathers, Pirkei Avot, about what is a machloket l'shem shamayim, what is an argument for the sake of heaven. And I certainly wish that in every argument I engage in, I'd ask myself, is this for the sake of heaven? What does that even mean? What does it mean to really question your own motives and make sure that your motives as can be, I'm not sure we can ever have truly pure motives, but to try to make them as pure and directed and the least harmful as possible. But what I wanted to ask you, Howard, about that Maimonides source, and then I'll take some questions I know that we have in the chat room, is Maimonides says that at a certain stage, if someone's not listening to you, you actually use physical violence. And I'm wondering how you deal with that, because you've talked about Maimonides' use of soft language and privacy. But when something gets, when there's a lot of resistance, Maimonides sort of turns up the heat on that.
As far as let me just pull back just a drop. My focus on the book was like, I'm trying to stay away from theoretical discussions. Most of my material, even though I preface the book, in the preface I say that this is not a halachic guide I'm presenting, far from it. But my focus was halacha lemasa, practical applications of the material. So as far as in real world situations, when Maimonides would condone any type of physical force, in our society, I don't believe it happens. You hear stories, outrageous stories in the news, but halacha lemasa, practical halacha, these days does not condone any type of physical force when it comes to implementing any of these laws. Maybe a few hundred years ago, in closed Jewish communities, there were situations when they felt it was necessary, it was called for al pi halacha. But as far as practical halachic applications, where we would use that, I can't imagine where it would come into play in modern society, and as far as practical halacha goes.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. I just want to share with you some things that we have in the chat. Daniel Roth shared that some of your chapters were turned into a practical school curriculum for Jewish education. Pardes. So he's out there selling your wares and making sure that they do have practical application. Thank you for that. Joseph asks, is there a formal training model that has been developed from the book? And I suppose that that Daniel's response it takes care of that. Is it individual or group training? So are there formal training models that have emerged, and is it for individuals or groups?
So as far as, let me just give you a little background of what initially what I was planning on doing, what I did with it, and what maybe one day down the road I will do with the material. Originally, I wanted to develop a curriculum which I would use in Jewish day schools, yeshivot, in synagogues, where I would teach this type of material. So for various reasons back in the graduate school, it never worked out that way. I decided I was going to just write a straight dissertation, just not as far as practical teaching model of any sorts. Then after I had completed the book, I ended up teaching at Yeshiva University High School for Girls for 5 years. And I took my material and I developed a curriculum from it. And I was teaching this material straight, well, not straight, I threw in a lot more Hebrew, and I made it a little more simplistic and a little more easily understood. So I taught for 5 years this material to ninth grade girls. And I thought it was terrific. And my students, I think also they enjoyed it. As far as developing a full-blown curriculum, that's something which is going to have to wait for a little while. Maybe, God willing, hopefully one day down the road, I'll be able to do that. So that's as far as practical applications go. As far as teaching it in a group setting or an individual setting, it's hopefully like in a classroom setting of some sorts.
Okay. Actually, to the earlier point, Howard, Timothy says, in prisons, when approaching an inmate who's angry, the wise correctional officer pens with respect, speaks softly, moves the conversation to a private place, and gives the inmate as many ways out of the situation as possible. So there's a practical application.
That's unbelievable. They're using the Rambam. They're using Maimonides in the prison system.
Reverend Bradley Long, who joined us last week, nice to have you with us, asks, how do you see the principles of Judaic interpersonal conflict resolution as being applicable for conflicts between communities and nations? For example, and I suppose the most obvious one that's on our minds right now is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which has been brewing for 100 years.
So,
I would say
what was that? I'm sorry?
No, I meant that, the modern conflict has been.
Right. So there are certain fundamental values and certain fundamental concepts which I talk about, which definitely have universal applications, not only interpersonal conflicts, intergroup conflicts, international conflicts. As far as, you do your utmost to promote peace and the importance of dialogue and trying to take the other party's perspective. These are all things which clearly have applications to all different levels of conflict. With that said, I also point out in the preface that, and this isn't only what me speaking, it's social psychologists, they've pointed out there are differences between the way you approach interpersonal conflicts and the way you approach intergroup conflicts. And some of them we understand just off the top of our head, we understand the differences. And because of the group dynamics, when you've got large groups, it becomes much more difficult to deal with the conflicts. The issues are blown out of proportion. People become much more aggressive and violent. There's a lot less empathy that people experience when it's intergroup conflict. So applications are not. Yes.
Why would that be the case? Why would there be less empathy or potential for violence than in an individual interaction?
So it's been a long time since I've read those studies, but from what I remember, it's, when you've got groups of people gathering together and they have a certain mindset, each individual is strengthening and building off the other person's comments, their emotions, and just things start to swell.
Mutually reinforcing.
Exactly. That's exactly what I believe happens. As far as other mechanisms that come into play, I'm not sure off the top of my head, but we definitely see that's the way it plays out. As far as dealing with intergroup conflicts or international conflicts, I believe there would be other mechanisms and other things that, other variables that come into play, which would complicate things. And it would not be a clear application of some of my material just to apply it to intergroup conflicts. But as I said, certain fundamental principles, definitely there across the board.
And Reverend Long alerted us to, a political conflict, an international political conflict. But here in North America, in the United States in particular, we're just in the long tail of a politically charged landscape that has really put people in echo chambers that they haven't left. And I'm wondering how your research, what you could bring to bear in sort of thinking about how to heal that fracture. Can that fracture be healed?
Earlier, you talked about one of your favorite Jewish texts as far as, an argument for the sake of heaven. So that is one topic which I examine at length in the book. And I think a lot of the material that I develop in that chapter, what I did is, once again, this is not my own original material. Well, some of it is, there's some of me speaking in there as well. But some of the concepts which the commentators on that text have focused on over the years, they talk about things like the importance of intellectual integrity, not crossing a line and engaging in personal attacks on people who disagree with you. Also perspective taking, being open and honest, and understanding that maybe, and listening with an open ear. So these are all fundamental concepts which are so absent from what's going on in America these days between different political groups and different groups throughout America. So those types of things, particularly in that area, that's where I would probably have the most to say about this topic. Once again, I would have to give that a little thought as far as developing an actual application to American society as far as what we're dealing with. But that's where I would focus on those types of mechanisms which are discussed in the context of what Judas call a conflict for the sake of heaven, or what we call today in conflict resolution theory as constructive conflict.
Okay, so
I'm sorry, I'm not giving you a really good answer. I know that.
No, I'm going to push you because you're going to have to give a good answer to this.
Oh no. You want me to heal the divide of what's going on in America in just in 5-10 minutes? It's not going to happen, but go ahead.
Well, we could give you 15 or 20.
Okay, well.
Let's say you get a call from the White House and someone says, Dr. Kaminsky, you'll be surprised. You might not be surprised to know that President Biden has fundamentals of Jewish conflict resolution on his night table.
I would be very surprised.
They always want to know what's on the president's night table. And, it's a pretty big book and he doesn't have a lot of time. What chapter should he read and why?
That chapter, which I was just referring to, it's that chapter about constructive conflict. That's I believe it's the third chapter of the book. That's the focus. That's the place you focus on. That would have the greatest applicability to what's going on in America and throughout the world as far as intergroup conflicts. And there would be a lot of material there, which I think is worthwhile for these types of situations.
Okay. And then when he's on the phone to Prime Minister Netanyahu, he can share that with him and tell him that, that open up chapter 3.
Sure. I got to tell you,
yeah,
this is one great dream you conjured up over here. This is unbelievable. I don't think it's ever going to happen, but you never know.
You never know. You never know who's listening here at GW. I say that because the ideas that you're talking about largely seem to apply in one-on-one relationships, in individual relationships. And what I'm hearing in the chat is a sort of push to invite you to think about how this applies in much larger scale issues where I think right now, we're struggling to find wisdom and systems and sort of large overarching concepts to make us think differently about conflict.
I totally relate to that concern, and I understand the concern and the issue over there as far as, because that's what everybody focuses on. But I think a lot of this starts at home, with the individual. It's, if you can develop certain qualities in your own life, your interactions with other people, that's the starting point. No doubt about it, at least for me, as far as, you approach your interactions with others in a respectful, sensitive way, and with an open ear to hearing what the other person says and taking their perspective. You apply that to all areas in life. That's what I've found. As far as doing research on that topic, one of the things I say at the end of the book is that it would be worthwhile. This is a desideratum. This is something that hopefully somebody will work on. I don't know if I'm ever going to get to it, but to do in-depth research on traditional Jewish approaches to intergroup conflict. As far as third-party intermediaries, Daniel picked up the baton and he's worked on that, which is amazing. Hopefully, people will build on what myself, what Daniel has done, and will develop other models as far as based upon traditional Jewish sources. The sources offer an enormous amount in all of these areas, and they'll be able to do research and to be able to apply it. But as far as what my focus was, yes, the focus is on interpersonal. There are applications, but that's where I think it all starts.
Okay, and I just want to share that Daniel dropped into the chat that your book is co-taught to graduate students in Israel by a Jewish studies professor with an Islamic professor who brings the parallel Islamic sources, which must be, it's just such, I'd love to sit in that classroom. So the book is being used as a first step in a culture of conflict resolution, and the Machloket Matters project deals directly with the political divide in the U.S. And is based on the way that you've defined machloket l'shem shamayim. Daniel, do you want to jump into this conversation? I know that wasn't really expected, but you asked me if you could speak for a minute about to address this. So can I, Howard? Is it all right if we bring?
No, are you kidding me, Daniel? It's always a pleasure to be around Daniel.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I just felt like I want to say about those 2 points that you just mentioned, Erica, which is that Kaminsky's book goes beyond just sharing the Jewish sources. It's first of all showing the sources that no one's ever heard of in a very in-depth way, and then comparing it with all the contemporary academic literature. So once you have a model of traditional religious sources being compared to contemporary social sciences, that then allows for a theoretical framework to insert other religious traditions. So the step to now for us to go into Islamic sources, which is also a very deep legal tradition, and to look at what are their religious rules, how you ask for forgiveness, and when you forgive and don't forgive, and how do those compare to the contemporary social psychology literature? Well, Chaim already did that work. So it's very easy to kind of fit that in. And the method that we've been using based upon Chaim's book is not just in the academic context in Israel, but through our 60 mediation centers, 10 of them in the Arab sector, is that we've been using that as a training model for sheikhs and rabbis that can then bring a culture of mediation, conflict resolution within each of their own communities, and therefore allowing for both the particularism of each religious and cultural identity group, but yet a shared language that we're all talking about forgiveness, constructive conflict, anger management. So he created a conceptual framework that you can insert into trainings for schools, for religious leaders, and of course for academics. And regarding the second point, as I noted, one of the reasons why we're able to gather here is because the Machloket Matters project, which is literally how to disagree constructively and the work of thinking about the political divides and how text can help impact the brain's ability to deal with those political divides. All of that comes from Chaim's book of conceptualizing, introducing to the world that there are Jewish wisdom about constructive conflict, which is at the very heart of the democratic process, the ability of two different parties to not kill each other, disagree, learn, and then solve problems. So I think it's that combination of the Jewish text with the contemporary is a real, very important contribution to the academic and to the practical field.
Yeah, fantastic. So setting the groundwork for the kind of work that you're doing in the actual field. A question for either or both of you. You mentioned sheikhs, you mentioned rabbis, the Muslim and Jewish tradition. Where does Christianity fit in this worldview?
Daniel, do you want to take that?
We also relate to Christian sources. It's again, you can bring tons of Christian sources with a Christian scholar, and because the conceptual framework is already there. I've done it also with other religious traditions when I've taught Indian students and other. I mean, once you have that conceptual definition of what is forgiveness, what is anger management, what is constructive conflict, and that you take the social psychology and you put it into a cultural context, which is hard to appreciate because we think it's, this is science and you can apply the American Western social psychological terms to every context. Then you realize, wait a minute, there's a difference between traditional Jewish sources or Islamic sources and these contemporary. So it allows for a conversation of different religious traditions. I think it's easiest to do it with Islam because it's a legal system, but it certainly can be applied to Christianity.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, Timothy mentioned again in the chat room, part of the challenge is the fact that we speak in groups, Muslims, Jews, Catholics, Protestants, whites, non-whites. The Baha'i suggests that they're not groups, just one set of humans, right? That all religions are one religion. And that's a little bit different than Ari Goldman, who wrote Finding God at Harvard. Is that the exact title? Where he says, if you know one religion, you know one religion, right? And you don't know all religions, and religions have very distinct approaches to forgiveness, to anger, to conflict. And it sounds like this book enabled the beginning of a rich and substantive conversation, a legal conversation, as opposed to a kumbaya sort of, we should all be together. Anything else you want to say, Daniel, before we go back to Howard? You're good? You're muted. Okay.
Just as far as Christian sources go, I just wanted to say, a number of years ago, we're talking about at least 15 years ago, I was trying to pitch a course to different colleges. Nobody picked it up, but it was different religious approaches to conflict resolution. And I had done a ton of research on Christian, Muslim, Hindu, and there's what to apply to all religious traditions. I remember I spoke at a conference once, and I was saying, you can take this model, which I've developed, and you could and it was a widespread of different religious groups that were taking part in this conference. And I said, you can all apply this just as well to your own religious traditions. So definitely it's multiple applications.
So I'm particularly interested in the forgiveness side of this. The Holocaust historian, Dr. Deborah Lipstadt, who's a close personal friend, and I have been working on a book on forgiveness for the past few years, based on Maimonides' work, Hilchot Tshuva, the Laws of Repentance. And one of the things that that's very, very striking in the research that we did is that today, a lot of conflict doesn't get resolved because apologies are actually sort of formalistic public declarations that are sort of, celebrity, an athlete, a politician does something wrong. There's a public apology. The public apology, if you study it, I've actually studied them sort of like a Talmudic text to see how poorly they respond to the actual wrong that's committed. And it's sort of a pass through so that I can, pass go and just, collect $200, just move on, get out of jail card, so to speak. As opposed to a real act of contrition and a sense of accountability. The New York Times used to actually print in the business section some while ago, the worst apology of the week. And so in thinking about that, how do you think people should apologize better as a technique for managing conflict?
Where do you begin? There's an enormous amount of material and research on what constitutes helpful apologies as opposed to apologies which just fall on deaf ears. Enormous. It's in the second to the last chapter. I compiled all this material, and they've done studies, empirical studies, as far as what people need to hear. You just touched on some of the main things as far as somebody's contrite, somebody who means it, not just to give some type of excuse. There has to be a degree of sincerity. The person has to know that you're not going to be engaging in anything like this in the future. Those are just some of the things that they touch on. There's an enormous body of literature that discusses what people need as a good apology, and what's a sincere apology. Judaism also has its approach as far as Maimonides, as you say. It's if you're working with Maimonides in his Hilchot Tshuva, there's the
laws of repentance, for those people.
Right. I'm sorry, I didn't explain that. So there's a he's not a Jewish researcher. He said he picked up Maimonides' laws of repentance, and he said he was taken aback by it, and he said that this is a guide to how you're supposed to apologize. And it's just, this is a text. This is how you do tshuva. This is how you do a sincere, a real apology. I couldn't even scratch the surface of what Maimonides has to say about this. It's not only with Maimonides, there's just an enormous amount of literature that discusses what constitutes a good apology, al pi halacha, according to Jewish law, and what doesn't. When you should be accepting an apology, when you should not be accepting an apology. So that's all in the chapter 8 of my book. But I couldn't summarize. I couldn't do it justice. I really couldn't. I wish I could, but
well,
Ayin Sham. That's where I discuss it.
Yeah, look there. Catherine Wallen, who's joining us, welcome. Catherine says she loves the chapters that speak, particularly chapter 8 about issues of forgiveness. She says we read this together as a group the month before high holidays. So certainly your book is having that reach.
That's unbelievable. That's what I wrote it for. I specifically had that in mind. By the way, I'm not kidding you.
Well, she says. You speak of making the victim available themselves to hear or to dialogue, and asking at least 3 times, right? And I guess creating the readiness to hear sorry. Joseph mentions that he invites everyone listening to look at the Alternatives to Violence project as a workshop training model that shares much of what Dr. Kaminsky has discussed, and he shares where one could do that. But he also asked a question: is trauma addressed in the book as a solution in a conflict?
As a solution, I'm not exactly sure what the implication of that is as a solution. That question, as far as
you can drop in the chat if you want to clarify anything about that question. David's asked, how, if at all, do the traditional sources relate to issues raised by family systems, such as maintaining a non-anxious presence, diffusing triangles, and lowering emotional intensity?
So as far as the family dynamics also complicate things. We understand, as far as tension, everybody relates to family arguments differently, but generally speaking, there's a certain greater degree of intensity when it comes to family conflicts. Once again, I have not focused in specifically on family dynamics, and I wouldn't venture to express an informed opinion about that until I would explore those sources in depth. With that said, the same basic mechanisms that Judaism promotes and talks about as far as dealing with all types of conflicts and all types of tensions, and those dynamics are applicable across the board. As far as being open to what your spouse says, or being open to hear what your child has to say, and to speak in a respectful and sensitive manner to the other, that runs across the board. As far as the family dynamics, as I said, it does complicate things, and I do not specifically focus on those type of family dynamics in the book.
Okay. Now, Daniel mentioned in his cameo appearance, Daniel mentioned that there are sources that have not been seen before. Do you want to give us a little taste of that? Maybe a source that we're not familiar with. A number of people here, we have someone who wrote in the chat room about Rabbi Sacks's work on Maimonides and the conflict that Joseph had with his brothers. So Maimonides is a more well-known source, something that we haven't heard.
So many. It's where do you begin? Pick one.
Or even two.
Okay. I'll do. How about one? One. It's just one of my favorite. Do you mind? Let me just pull over the book over here. 1 second.
It's always good to read your own book. Sometimes.
Yeah. I tried to go through most of it before this little gathering. Here we go. There's what I think is a beautiful quote from Rabbi Abraham Isaac HaKohen Kook. He was the first chief rabbi of Israel in the 20th century, the early half of the 20th century. This doesn't address conflict per se. I'm discussing like underlying fundamental values of Judaism, which play out and have a major role as far as dealing with conflict. So at one point, I cite a halachic text that's discussing Ahavat Yisrael, love of a fellow Jew. And in this text, you walk away with the impression that, according to Jewish law, you only have to exhibit love to a fellow Jew, but when somebody who's not Jewish, somebody from a different religion, you don't have to exhibit love to them. So this, I think this is an incredible quote. This is the quote from Rabbi Kook. And I introduced this by saying this following quote is applicable to any type of rabbinic literature which may give you similar impressions. So Rabbi Kook wrote like this: the concept of ahavat habriot, love of humanity, that's love for all humanity, it requires an extensive treatment. We have to do some serious studying of this topic. This is in order to combat the superficial understanding that emerges from an initial examination of the traditional Jewish sources due to a lack of proper training in Torah texts and the prevailing ethics, which give the impression as if there exists in Judaism contradictions or at least an indifference concerning this type of love, that is universal love, which in reality needs to constantly fill all the chambers of one's soul. that's an important text for me personally. I think I'm very moved by that text. And somehow, I did a search online. You can find this online, but it's relatively obscure, that text. And it's a beautiful, I love the text because of the inherent idea itself. And I see we're running out of time. So that would be one good text to keep in mind, something to walk away with and to remember. And just one other thing, which I think is very apropos with what's going on in Israel. There's a midrash, and this people are familiar with. There's a midrash on the verse, you should seek peace and run after it. The dual expression of running after peace, it sounds like you're supposed to seek peace even when it's elusive and it requires that extra effort. So the midrash says, you should seek peace today and run after it tomorrow. And what does that mean? The Chafetz Chaim, Rabbi Israel Meir HaKohen, the saintly Chafetz Chaim, he said, that text is teaching you, don't give up on trying to attain peace. Seek it today, tomorrow, the next day, until you attain it. That's something worthwhile to walk away with.
Peace is so elusive, and even defining it and maybe thinking that peace looks like serenity and contentment, as opposed to adjudicating a way for people to live together and be able to fully express themselves. I'm thinking a lot about Natan Sharansky's book called Defending Identity, where he talks about democracy as a platform, as a conceptual platform that allows people to express their full identities. And yet democracies often flatten people's identities, because the idea of living peacefully means I'm not really asserting myself. How do you understand the work that you're doing in conflict resolution as an expression of democracy?
The things that I discuss in the book as far as interacting with your fellow human being, these are the cornerstones of democracy, as far as how you're supposed to live in a civil society with your fellow human being. They all come into play. And once again, there are issues with democracy, but as far as, Winston Churchill, the famous quote, as far as, it may be a crazy approach to things, but it's the best approach that we've found so far in history. But as far as human interaction with your neighbor, your fellow American, anybody that you interact with, these are all core concepts of democracy that I'm touching on.
And we did hear from Joseph, and what he meant is reducing the effects of trauma taken up in the book as a way to resolve conflict.
Oh, okay. So it's touched on in that chapter when I talk about forgiveness. As far as serious trauma, it's not so simple. You understand, as far as how you're supposed to address serious trauma. And, I'm reticent to express views because it gets so complicated when you're dealing with trauma, as far as how you're supposed to deal with any given situation. There are so many variables involved. And, I do touch on it. And sometimes I touch on it without spelling it out clearly. And I'm relying on the reader to understand that this is what I'm referring to. But generally speaking, I do not focus on that because of it. It's, this is something you mentioned earlier when you were talking about, giving people criticism. When you deal with people, and particularly in Jewish sources, they're relying on that the reader or the people that you're dealing with have a certain level of maturity and emotional maturity, and they've attained a certain level of understanding and wisdom in life and common sense. And we understand that that's not always the case. And when you're dealing with those types of situations, those are just some of the main variables that, just complicate conflict to no end. And trauma as well, as far as how you're supposed to deal with it. As I said, that's where I address it somewhat, but it's not a major focus, once again.
Right. Catherine was talking about the unforgivable situation that you write about. Do you want to share a little bit about that?
Unforgivable situation. You know, I present, when it comes to the unforgivable situation, I present three different approaches that I found in the sources. I present one source that says, and once again, you understand, this is not, I'm just presenting what somebody else has said. By the way, let me just explain. I'm the child of a Holocaust survivor.
Me
So
too.
well, really. So I'm well aware of what it means to be unforgiven, an unforgivable situation. It's, my grandparents, my aunts and uncles lost them all. And my father, what he went through, it was unspeakable what he went through during the war. As far as those types of situations, can you forgive? Should you forgive? I'm not going to touch that with a 10-foot pole. As far as day-to-day conflicts, day-to-day situations that people view as quote unquote unforgivable, those types of things which very often, which people consider unforgivable, in those types of things, there is one opinion that says it's not true. What day-to-day activities, day-to-day conflicts, what people very often consider unforgivable, not necessarily so. It's just, we develop in our mind, I just can't forgive this thing. That's one approach. There's another approach that says that, and once again, when I'm talking about forgiving somebody, we're talking if somebody has sincerely repented and they've given you that sincere apology, and you know that it's for real. And in those type, and once again, even then, somebody hurts you so badly, how do you forgive them? So there is an approach. I quote this in the name of Reb Chaim David Halevi, who was the chief rabbi of Tel Aviv. He says that sometimes you can't forgive somebody. What happens when somebody has done everything on their part to apologize, and according to Judaism, you're supposed to be forgiving them, and when that is, it's not so clear. And sometimes, are you supposed to forgive somebody if you're going to be hurting yourself thereby? Not so simple. But in cases where Judaism would say, yes, you should be forgiving, and you can't find it in your heart to forgive. So the way he approached the situation is that sometimes you show forgiveness through your actions. In your heart, you may still harbor some bad feelings towards the person, but you treat the person with civility, you treat the person the way you're supposed to be treating people, and then in time, possibly you can find it in your heart to forgive the person. There's another approach that sometimes you've got to work on yourself. We all have to work on ourselves, internally develop ourselves. Sometimes people are petty as far as what angers us, as far as what we focus in on, what we exaggerate, we magnify. So these are some of the things I touch on when I talk about those types of unforgivable situations. But it's, once again, nothing is simple and straightforward. If I present it that way in the book, it's sometimes I oversimplify things. I do, because we understand it gets life gets messy, life gets complicated.
Yeah, I was very struck in thinking about that question by something that the philosopher Avishai Margalit writes about in his book, The Ethics of Memory. He says, we talk in society about forgiving and forgetting, but we know that that's really not realistic. He says, and yet you can make a conscious decision to not let the incident influence you by sharing it with others, by obsessively reviewing it. So it's not that you forget, but you do make a conscious decision that this won't occupy the same kind of place in your heart and mind, which I vote by that.
There's what you're just touching on, and I do go into it in great detail in the book, as far as there's different approaches. As far how do you define forgiveness? Is it a conscious cognitive decision, or is this something that you have to do on an emotional level? If you do the conscious, they're called decision-based process models of forgiveness, how that affects, you decide that I'm going to forgive the person, how that affects you internally. There are different approaches, different theories, how that works, and probably different people work different ways.
Yeah. I'm very struck by your modesty. I'm very struck by your modesty, because when I'm looking at this book, just the index alone, the bibliography, that the depth of the research, even the minute interpersonal relations that you focus on, all of those things, I think, and speaking to you about this, make me think that resolving conflict, it's really a work of art. It's really the work of life. And in some way, every argument that we approach in an interpersonal context demands to be the first argument that we've ever had with the person. It was there's something where we're trying to clear the ground every time and not invite that sort of mountain of background into the argument to say, oh, we've been here before, and I'm going to say this, and you're going to say that. And I'm wondering if you have any closing advice for our listeners about how to take this challenge, this everyday challenge, and just do it better.
That requires a lot of internal work, I think. I'll be honest, I've also been guilty, sometimes, when you rehash the same things again and again, it gets very difficult. There's no denying that. As far as, you try to put in, you try to remember what you're supposed to be doing as far as what it takes to handle any given situation. When I'm thrown into a situation like that myself, usually I approach it, right beforehand. I remind myself, okay, what you got to do and what you're not supposed to do, as far as rehash old stuff and, bring to the surface, the old emotions. You got to approach it calmly and think about what you're supposed to be doing. Focus on the problem. Don't get sidetracked. It requires some development and some internal, you got to work on yourself. And I wish I had an easy answer for that, but just don't lose your head. Try not to lose your head. Focus on what you're supposed to be doing in any given situation. And if you know what you're supposed to be doing, you're going to be okay if you stick to it.
Yeah, you really have raised the bar on really the type of thinking that we need to do. And this is in some way the most critical thinking that we have to do right now. We have to do it in Israel, we have to do it in America in large scale groups and in our personal lives, because we live in those echo chambers and in an often unforgiving cancel culture. I can't really think of a better volume to help us think about this. So I want to make sure that that access to the book is provided in the chat. I don't know who's responsible for that, so that those of you who want to follow up and read this wonderful book, Fundamentals of Jewish Conflict Resolution, can do so. Please look into Machloket Matters, the Machloket Matters project, and Pardes offerings. We're always happy to have you with us here at the Mayberg Center for Jewish Education and Leadership, in partnership with the Judaic Studies Department at George Washington University. Thank you so much to everyone for being with us today. Thank you, Howard.
Pleasure. Thank you, Erica.
I want to thank both of you, Erica Brown and Howard Kaminsky. What an enriching and inspiring conversation and opportunity to learn with you. I want to reiterate Pardes' thanks to our two partners here, the Mayberg Center for Jewish Education and Leadership at GW and the Judaic Studies program at GW, and to also express my gratitude to Rabbi Dr. Daniel Roth and Dr. Robert Eisen for your partnership in organizing the first part of the series last week, and again to Dr. Erica Brown and Rabbi Dr. Howard Kaminsky for tonight's program. Thank you so much, everyone.